Eva Bartlett es una periodista independiente y activista canadiense. Ha vivido 3 años acumulativos en Gaza desde noviembre de 2008, documentando la vida de los palestinos bajo el yugo del régimen sionista. También ha visitado el Líbano y ha estado 4 veces en Siria desde 2014, reportando la vida diaria del pueblo sirio y la barbarie provocada por Occidente y el terrorismo patrocinado. Eva se considera antisionista, antiimperialista y a favor de la justicia. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Welcome, Eva.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be with you finally.
Well, first, could you please share a little more about yourself, why you do what you do, and how you started?
Yeah, I mean, my story, actually, it's good to tell it because sometimes people think that doing this type of work is only for political analysts or journalists who've been trained in journalism. And actually, I came to it in a very roundabout way, very late in life, actually discovering the issue of Palestine, kind of diving headfirst into that very tragic issue of the colonization of Palestine, displacement of so many hundreds of thousands of people, and the ongoing genocide. And I ended up going to Palestine and witnessing some of the worst crimes that the Zionists perpetrate against Palestinian civilians. And as you said in your introduction, I lived in Gaza for a few years, doing volunteer work, working with farmers and fishers. And during 2 major Zionist wars on Gaza, I was documenting on the ground, riding with medics, both in order to hopefully prevent the Zionists from attacking medics, but also to document the worst of the war crimes that they were committing in 2008-9 and in 2012. I also have become, over the years, more informed about the schemings of imperialist nations upon nations that don't cater to what the imperialists want and Zionists want. And Libya, as we know, was an example of this. Libya has been almost destroyed by so-called humanitarian intervention. And this was the same project that they had for Syria, and thankfully, until now, Syria has not been destroyed. But it's been a very bloody 6 years for the people of Syria. So when in early 2011 things began in Syria, I started paying attention to alternative and independent media and trying to inform myself as best I could. And finally, in April of 2014, I had the opportunity to first go to Syria. And since then, it's been quite a learning experience and quite a humbling experience, because the Syrian people, in spite of all the suffering and the bloodshed that they are enduring, thanks to the NATO, Zionist, Turkish Gulf alliance, they are still some of the most loving and generous and hospitable and fun and kind people that I've ever met. And they maintain this integrity and they maintain this dignity in spite of the fact that over 120 or 130 countries are warring against them. So after my first visit to Syria, I felt it was necessary to go back and to learn as much as possible from the people, because quite clearly what our media is telling us are lies. And when you go and you talk to the people, you get a 100% different story than what you'd hear on corporate media.
Eva, we have read your articles and we have listened to interviews from you, and what strikes us the most immediately is how different it is what you see on the ground than what we read on Western media. So what would you say, as a way of introduction, what would you say are the biggest lies that we receive here in the West from corporate media as opposed to what you see on the ground?
There's so many, it's hard to start, but in general, the whole war on Syria, the main themes have been unarmed protesters being savagely attacked by the Syrian forces, which they call Assad's forces, and that in itself is another myth. The other main one has been that the people, by and large, do not like President Assad and they want him gone. These are myths, I'm not endorsing these myths. And that the army is brutalizing the people, that the army is starving the people, that the army is like destroying entire neighborhoods. This is the allegations that we hear. So I'll start with the first myth of unarmed protesters. Now, I think you guys probably read the longish article I wrote last year called Deconstructing the NATO Narrative on Syria, in which I linked to many very well researched and detailed articles which broke down these myths of unarmed protesters. But actually, this last time in Syria, I was able to meet a soldier who was based in Dara in the very beginning, at the very first protest. And what he told me, it drastically contradicts the lies of the mainstream media. The lies of the mainstream media were that people in Dara came out to protest for freedom and democracy. He was in Dara. He was actually not originally stationed there, but he and I think I'd have to look at my notes, but 200 or so soldiers were sent there because there was word there were going to be protests. But they were sent there without weapons. The only weapon they had was one of those batons, those wooden batons. That's it, no arms. The day of the first protest, on a Friday, after Friday prayers, people came out of the mosque. And just to corroborate his story, I've also been told by people who lived in Dara that they heard these sectarian slogans being shouted in the mosques from these radical imams, Saudi and Qatari, trained imams. And so the day of the first protest, he and the other soldiers and the local police force were there all unarmed, including the police. They only had these batons, and they were swarmed by a mob of protesters, among whom there were people that had arms, and they were shot at. And he was scared for his life, and he's a strong soldier, but he had no way of defending himself. And he told me that they ended up running back to their base inside, I forget the name of the building. The protesters chased them and were throwing Molotov cocktails and I'm sure what else. And this scenario repeated itself every Friday for 3 weeks. And they kept asking their commanders, because the order was from top down. It wasn't a local decision not to give them weapons. It was the Syrian government knowing that if the soldiers were armed, that the media would use this against them and say they were slaughtering people. They did not get arms for the first 3 weeks. They did not have any way of defending themselves. And finally, they were able to take arms and they were able to fight the terrorists that were attacking them. These are terrorists that people were calling unarmed protesters. And he's not the first person to, this is an eyewitness testimony, but in the article that I referenced, the Deconstructing the NATO Narrative in Syria, I referenced Sharmeen Narwani's article called The Hidden Massacres. And she talks about incidences like this. And Professor Tim Anderson, in many of his writings and in his book, he talks about the fact that in Dara, again, these unarmed protesters, there was a weapons storage in the Al-Omari Mosque in Dara. And indeed, the soldier that I interviewed, he corroborated this. He said he saw this weapons storage himself. So this is one of the myths, and this type of thing took place throughout Syria. This past time, I was in Syria for 9.5 weeks. I count each and every fortunate day to have been there. And I traveled around quite a bit. But on prior visits, I also, I went to some of the key places like Homs. And as you know, Homs was dubbed by the corporate media the capital of the so-called revolution. And in prior visits in Homs, I met with people who were aggressed by terrorists that took over the old city of Homs, that stole every last piece of food, that were not bringing them freedom or democracy or revolution, that they were terrified from. And I also met with people who were of the Alawi sect and said, this one man said, if they had known that he was Alawi, they would have murdered him, because from the very beginning they said in Arabic, the equivalence of expression was Christians to Beirut and we're going to kill the Alawis. And many people have told me this. And this is not to make Syria sectarian, because Syria is a very secular nation. And this is another myth, actually, we should discuss. The way the Western media portrays this is that it's Sunni against Assad's forces, or Sunnis against Alawis, or Sunnis against Hezbollah. All this is bullshit and crap. The Syrian society is very secular. I cannot begin to count the number of times I've been sitting with a group of people, and if the subject comes up, people in the group are of every sect you can imagine, and they're all sitting there amiably. This sectarianism didn't exist in Syria. From what I understand, the only time it really existed in any small degree was the Muslim Brotherhood, and their history in Hama and their history of bloodbath. So the myths, unarmed protesters is not true, and peaceful protesters for the first 6 months is not true. The myth of Syria being sectarian itself is not true. This is brought from the Gulf states, Saudi and Qatar and Turkey as well. And also the myth of that President Assad is not popular is absolutely not true. Yes, there are terrorists, and yes, there are people that support the terrorists, and yes, there are people who are not terrorists that don't like President Assad, but the overwhelming majority of people like him, even love him. And especially since the crisis started, there are people that maybe they wanted political change in Syria, but they actually, most people I've talked with who have said this, they didn't have any particular issues with President Assad. It was they wanted changes in the constitution or other political reforms. But President Assad, I mean, if you compare Syria to Libya to Iraq, what do these nations have in common other than the fact that they didn't cower to imperialism and Zionism? They also have figureheads that the West has demonized, because if you demonize the figurehead, then it's easy to gain popular support to go in and bomb the hell out of the country in the name of democracy and human rights.
Wow, that's, oh, thank you so much. That's actually very refreshing. Another one of those myths that are espoused in the West is that it's really difficult to discern who these moderate rebels are, who these mercenaries are from the actual forces of the government. People have these notion that it's really hard to tell who is who in Syria, and I would like to maybe ask you, from your experience talking to people on the ground, is it something that is really easy to discern for them, essentially who is on potentially their side and who are these external mercenary foreign forces that come and attack them, essentially? Like, can they distinguish between them and the other groups?
To be honest, most people I've met, and again, I was just in Aleppo twice in this last visit, in July and in August, most people I've met don't bother discerning between them, because the so-called pre-Syrian army, which were the groups that, you know, in the initial unarmed protesters eventually became the so-called pre-Syrian army, they have committed as heinous and bloody acts as any of al-Nusra or Ahrar al-Sham or al-Zinki or Daesh, ISIS. Most Syrians I know say they're all the same. They're all the same in that they've committed these heinous bloody acts, beheadings, rapings, kidnappings, etc., as Daesh has. And at the same time, they all have some sort of foreign backing, Saudi, Qatar, Turkey, and they're receiving their weapons via Turkey. And they're all serving the same agenda, which is destabilizing and destroying Syria. So the majority of people I've met in Syria, throughout the country, they don't need to distinguish. They can. They know that in Ghouta it tends to be, you know, Ahrar al-Sham, FSA, Nusra, but, you know, everywhere where these terrorists are, in the end, they're committing the same acts, so it doesn't really matter. I think the important thing to note is that they aren't moderates, and there are no moderates. Moderates exist at the political level. There are moderate opposition in Syria that the West will never name and they will never interview because it doesn't serve their agenda. They prefer to have moderates that one day are with Ahrar al-Sham and, you know, murdering Syrians with their hell cannon, gas canister bombs or mortars or other missiles and rockets, and the next day they've shaved their beards, cut their hair, they're in a suit and they're going to Geneva. I mean, these are the West's moderates. But in fact, in Syria, all the terrorists are committing the same disgusting, despicable acts against the Syrian people and its heritage.
Eva, what do you think about the anti-Russian propaganda campaign from Western mass media using the photo of the little Syrian boy pulled from the rubble in Aleppo after an alleged airstrike by Syrian government or Russian forces?
It seems to be a very coordinated media effort, propaganda effort, and this is not the first time this has happened. But just looking at this one issue in particular, so the boy, Amran, 4 or 5 years old, there are many people that have actually analyzed the video. I've been traveling, so I haven't had a chance to do any writing on this, but I know the basics in that the video itself appears to be very staged. The boy may or may not be injured. Even assuming that he is injured, although if you look at the video, I mean, there's very little blood. He seems very unconcerned with the wound on his head. And more problematic, the rescuers are very unconcerned with him. They'd rather sit him down and take propaganda photos than actually tend to his wounds right away. This is not the activity of normal rescuers. Other problems with the video and the incident itself are that you can see in the video the White Helmets, and the White Helmets is a propaganda front group that has been outed many times now in very great depth, especially by, I'm sorry for the background noise here, but the White Helmets has been outed as essentially Al-Qaeda in Syria. They are backed by the UK and by the US. My colleague Vanessa Beeley has done a lot of very damning research into the White Helmets. And they work only in terrorist areas. So in terrorist areas of Aleppo and Idlib, for example, they cannot be found in government-secured areas, and the type of videos that show the white helmets will never show the Syrian civilians in the government-secured area of Aleppo, which number over 1.5 million, nor will they ever show the Syrian civilians, for example, in Damascus, that are killed and maimed daily by mortars, or other areas of Syria, or Fu and Kafaria, where they're killed and maimed daily by mortars. But back to the issue of this one boy, it's striking that every single major media publication had this boy's image on their front page or on their website. It's not coincidental. It's not at all, because what this serves as, it serves to pull on the heartstrings of well-meaning people around the world who really feel bad to see a child injured. And the fact, if the child is injured, it is sad. But the thing is that the people that have orchestrated this, they are the reason, if that boy was injured, they are the reason he is injured. And aside from that point, the Russian Ministry of Defense says they had no airplanes in that area on that particular day. So they say the footage that shows the attack or the bombing, it's more probably to have been a mortar, which could quite possibly have been fired by terrorists themselves. It's not the first time they would have staged a false flag event. They've done this many times in Syria. They did the false flag chemical weapons attack in Ghouta. They've committed many massacres in Latakia countryside, in Adra, in Aleppo, and they always blame it on the Syrian government and the Syrian Arab army. But in the end, we find out that no, it was the terrorists themselves that committed these massacres. So back to this incident, what do you have? What's the follow-up after this boy's photo is splattered across pages and across Facebook pages and social media? You have people again saying, oh, Assad's forces, oh, the Assad regime, quote unquote, we must do something. And what is that something they must do? They're been led by these humanitarian NGOs, which are really just Wall Street and George Soros-backed NGOs that do the bidding of the imperialists. They're being led to believe that to do something, as in the case of Libya, was to impose a no-fly zone. And I believe that's what they want to do in Syria, because when did this happen, this boy's photo, this campaign? It happened after the liberation of the northern areas of Aleppo, Beni Zaid, and Leiramoun industrial district, and some certain eastern areas of Aleppo. It happened after the terrorists that were formerly being funneled supplies and more terrorists from Turkey, their road was cut off. And actually, when I was last in Aleppo, I went by Castello Road. And going down Castello Road, you can quite clearly see that highway that would have led to Turkey. And you see a number of terrorist vehicles littered along that highway, destroyed, because now this highway is cut off, and the terrorists are holed up in parts of eastern Aleppo without supplies. I believe that's the reason this campaign is taken off, because the West, the imperialists and the Zionists in the Gulf, they don't want the Syrian Arab army to fight terrorism, even though they say they're fighting terrorism. They want to continue to destabilize Syria, or potentially to try, even 6 years on, to try to install a puppet government in Syria. But the key thing, again, is that if they're so concerned with this one boy, why do they not care about the thousands of children that are murdered in Aleppo, in Fua, in Damascus, in any area that the terrorists are firing their missiles, their rockets, their mortars, their explosive bullets, their hell cannon, gas canisters on? Why do these children and these civilians not merit the same concern? It's because it's a campaign. It's because the media wants to confuse people what's really happening in Syria.
Eva, when you were discussing these issues about Western propaganda, I was reminded of these events at the end of June in Aleppo, in which we read on the media that Syrian and Russian forces were opening humanitarian corridors to get people out of Aleppo. And it sounded like a very positive news, but in many places in the West, and coming from the State Department in the US, it sounded like quite the opposite. They were quite hysterical. They were like, oh my God, they are taking, almost forcing people out of their houses, which sounded like completely over the top and completely unrealistic. And I know you've already touched upon this a little now that you were talking, but could you perhaps expand a little bit more on what you saw in Aleppo, because I know you were there recently?
Yeah, just the issue of the humanitarian corridors. I'm not surprised that the corporate media and Western leaders did actually spin it to say, oh, this isn't real, it's not happening, or they're forcing people out of their houses. In fact, independent media and also Russia Today and Syrian journalists that I know of, they interviewed people that did manage to leave via these humanitarian corridors. And what these people had to say was the same words that people from Yarmouk had to say, people from Madaya had to say, and people from the old city of Homs that I personally met. And what they said was, we wanted to leave. The terrorists prevented us from leaving. The terrorists stole any food that was there and sold it to us at exorbitant prices. This is exactly what people in Madaya said. And there was also footage and reporting on, after the humanitarian corridors were opened, the different terrorist factions. So we have Al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, the Nur al-Zinki, and other terrorist factions in eastern Aleppo. They were actually firing on people and preventing them from leaving. So it's not a case of anybody, the Syrian government, forcing anyone out of their houses. It's a case of people wanting to leave this area. Yes, there are people in those areas that support the terrorists, but for those who want to leave and those who are able to leave, what they had to say was that they don't support the terrorists. And when I was in Aleppo, I met with the head of the Aleppo Medical Association, Dr. Eva Bartlett. And he gave me some very interesting points, statistics, and you know, if we want to talk about another corporate media campaign earlier this year, and one which continues, it's the campaign of, for example, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, saying their hospitals are being bombed, or saying there's no doctors left in Aleppo. They're referring to the area of eastern Aleppo, whose population is actually unknown. Most corporate media and the UN would say 250 to 300,000. Other people say maybe 100,000 people, including the terrorists and their supporters. But they don't talk about the fact that in the 1.5 million plus population of Aleppo city, there are over 4,000. There's 4,160 doctors, I believe, registered in the Aleppo Medical Association, of whom there's 180 pediatricians and another 650 or so other specialists. The corporate media doesn't talk about this because this shatters their illusion. Their campaigns to say Aleppo, meaning eastern Aleppo, but they say Aleppo, has no doctors and the government is shelling hospitals. But when I was there in July, I went to the Al-Dabit maternity hospital, and this is a hospital where the terrorists who had fired missiles, one of their missiles or rockets landed right outside the hospital on a parked car, which exploded and also exploded neighboring parked cars, gutted the hospital, killed 3 women and injured many more. The Western media didn't talk about this. They spoke about these imaginary last pediatricians, and they spoke about hospitals which are not actually known hospitals, which are, in a sense, field hospitals. They're not registered. The coordinates were not given to the Syrians, the Russians, or the UN. So these are hospitals these are field hospitals. These are buildings where they're treating, in essence, they're treating terrorists. But the way the Western media and NGO complex spun it was to say these are civilians that are being targeted by the Syrian government or by Russia, and who should appear in the videos but the white helmets again, unsurprisingly. But back to Aleppo City. So the issue of doctors, they do exist, and they're numerous, and they're very active, and many of them are volunteering to save or give treatment to the civilians that are being targeted every single day by Western terrorists, or Western-backed terrorists, mortars and missiles and rockets, hell cannon-fired gas canisters, and explosive bullets. When I was in Aleppo, one of these explosive bullets, which apparently is called a 23 millimeter, and is used for targeting aircraft, but the terrorists are firing these randomly into the city. One of them landed 10 to 15 meters away. Luckily, it had already exploded, so it didn't do any damage and didn't hurt us. But had it landed on one of the parked cars, it would have been a different story. A day later, a friend who I'd seen that evening, a day later his mother was killed by one of these explosive bullets. It was just one incident of many people who are murdered by these terrorist munitions that Western media don't address. They don't splash photographs all over the front pages of websites and newspapers. And the other issues are electricity and water, because Aleppo, when I went in July, I went by a road called Ramusi, which if you're going from south towards Aleppo, there's a ring road, and at one point you go through a district called Ramusi, so it's in southern Aleppo. Just beyond Ramusi, there's a cement factory in Sheikh Said, and just a couple hundred meters beyond there are terrorists. So when we went in on Ramusi, the driver basically had to floor the car, gun it, speeding down the road for about 500 meters because this road is sniped. And indeed, after I left Aleppo, I read on Syrian media that a woman had been killed just a couple days after that by sniping from terrorists in the same area. That area is now closed because the terrorist sniping and shelling increased, so the government closed the road for protection of civilians. In that sense, Aleppo is somewhat under siege because the only other road in now is this liberated Castella road, which is the one I went in on in August. And this goes in through the north of Aleppo. But to speak of the roads and the siege, over the years, the terrorists have themselves closed down the Qanasr Highway or the roads leading into Aleppo, meaning that they've actually put the 1.5 million people of Aleppo under. At the same time as the Madaya campaign was happening, a very real siege on the villages of Fu and Kafadia in Idlib was happening and is happening since March 2015. Media doesn't mention it, the UN hardly addresses it, and aid almost never gets into Fu and Kafadia, and often if it does get in, it's food supplies or milk powder that's gone bad, or medicines that aren't complete, or medical equipment that aren't complete. So whether by intent or whether the terrorists are stealing these parts, any aid that does get into Fu and Kafadia isn't sufficient. The people there are actually starving and actually suffering from serious diseases. So I think back to Aleppo, what we have is an area where the Syrian army is making advances in securing the country. So in tandem, what the West does is ramp up these media campaigns and really ignore the actual suffering of Syrians throughout Syria.
Wow. Well, everything you've described here is quite dramatic and harrowing, and it invites to explore many more questions. But before I forget, I just want to ask one thing in particular about Aleppo, because the sense that we've been getting from this side, and based on the information we get, is that Aleppo was always like the last big stronghold of the terrorists of ISIS and Daesh and their allies and so on. And now that they seem to be, that the city seems to be liberated, or in the process of being liberated, at least most of it, do you actually get a sense that the conflict might actually be coming to an end, hopefully?
Sometimes it seems like that, and then, I mean, at this point, Turkey can't flood more terrorists into Aleppo, but what's happened in the past is when certain areas were liberated, then Turkey would just flood more terrorists in to support the terrorists already there. Because the Syrian Arab Army and allies have cut off the Castella road and the highway leading to Turkey, they can't do that anymore. So in one sense, there's hope that, you know, in Idlib and in Aleppo, the Syrian Arab Army and allies can actually contain and either eliminate the terrorists or get them to lay down their weapons. There's that hope, but then it seems like there's no Western political will whatsoever. No matter how many times the Syrian people say, leave us alone, let us be, let us solve our conflict, let us have our government, no matter how many times the Syrian people assert that, the Western leadership comes up with a new ruse to say that there must be a change of government, a regime change in Syria. So it's hard to say. I am somewhat confident, or hopeful, I should say, that it would end soon, because, I mean, realistically, after 6 years of this, the West and their Zionist and Gulf and Turkish allies must know the Syrian people don't want a change of government, and they don't want a puppet government, and they don't want their country cut up as per Iraq and Libya. So in that sense, I am hopeful, but nonetheless, I continue to be not surprised, but just pissed off, to be honest, at how deeply the media lies, how just immensely the media lies. Because for every time they have this picture of this boy, Amran, or before him, Aylan, if you remember the boy that drowned when a boatload of people seeking asylum in other countries, you know, it's a very tragic incident, but that boy's picture was manipulated, just like this boy, Amran's picture is being manipulated, whatever the context of the story. And this media is not addressing the people that are actually, you know, being killed and murdered, as I've mentioned before. So it's hard to say. I definitely have hope in the Syrian people and their resilience, but I'm astounded at just how filthy and deceitful our media is and our leadership. And, you know, I'm not following the U.S. presidential elections because, in my opinion, no matter who is president, they will commit to the same war agenda. However, Hillary Clinton has so much blood on her hands. It is quite worrying what she would do if she's president, because she seems less, she has no qualms whatsoever of going in and destroying the country and laughing gleefully about it. So in that sense, there's a bit of worry, but I'd like to stay hopeful instead.
Yeah, no, we pretty much agree with your sentiment regarding the United States elections. Essentially, the foreign policy gets determined by some other group other than the White House. But I wanted to ask you something that it's not really discussed, or that really or rarely gets any light on the Western media, at least, is the effect that the sanctions have on the Syrian people. Most people don't know that there have been sanctions, placed upon the country itself, and then not only do they have to deal with destruction, and then they're stealing the stealing of their own food and resources from the terrorists, but they also have sanctions placed upon them by other governments. So could you tell us maybe a little bit about what you have seen as to the impact of these sanctions on the people?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for bringing it up, because it's a very important point that I try to address often in writing, and that I think that the Western media, as I said, doesn't ever cover, because they're behind the sanctions. The sanctions, they cripple the health sector. They cripple the ability of, doctors and hospitals to get the equipment they need. For example, just a small example, when I was in Aleppo, Dr. Nabil Antaki, who he told me about his difficulty in getting one small part. I can't pronounce his profession. He's a gastroenterologist, I think that's how you say it. And he needed a particular device, and he couldn't get the part for that device, which he would normally get from Japan, from Nikon or Canon, one of those companies. And he could not get it because of the sanctions on Syria. I mean, this is just a medical device. He said it took him over a year just to get it in from Lebanon. Obviously, he had somebody bring it in, so it wasn't brought in by official means. But this is just one example. I mean, hospitals throughout Syria are suffering for want of proper equipment or ambulances that they cannot get in thanks to the sanctions. Also, it's crippling the economy. I mean, the war on Syria has crippled the economy. And the fact that, terrorists have looted the factories in Aleppo and taken them to Turkey, that's crippling the economy, but the sanctions as well. Syrians used to export. They used to be known for being completely self-reliant and exporting. When I was in Latakia and Tartus, I spoke with the governors there, and I asked them about many issues, including the sanctions, and they made that point, like the ports used to export, and now they're not able to. So this is something, the Western leadership would say, well, the sanctions are to bring down the regime, or whatever they're wording, but as Syrians themselves say, the sanctions are killing us. Sanctions are not hurting the government, they're hurting the people, just like in Iraq.
Eva, can you tell us more about how normal people cope with war situations such as is taking place in Syria? Could you comment about what you have seen there regarding the everyday life of the Syrian people coping with all this devastation and suffering? How do they keep going every day, and how does the government helps in that regard?
Yeah, it's an important question, and sometimes I write about things I've seen, or a wedding party I've been invited to, or very inspiring, hopeful things that you see in Damascus and Aleppo and other places in Tartus. I think an important point is to remember that Syrians are under war from all around the world, but they should not be expected to give up their lives. They should not apologize for living their lives. And the spirit that I've seen, even in areas that are hard hit, like Aleppo, is Syrians are very proud of their resilience and their defiance. Like when I went to Aleppo in July, it was during Ramadan, and at night the streets were packed with people, taking their kids out, going out for ice cream, going out to buy things. I mean, obviously, these are people that are impacted by the rockets and the missiles, but at the same time, they want to live their lives. In Damascus, so I first went to Syria in April 2014, and I spent a lot of time staying in the Bab Shabki, the East Gate area of the old city of Damascus. And let's see, April 2014, June 2014, December 2015, those times I was in Bab Shabki. And during those periods, the terrorist mortars from Jobar and eastern Ghouta in general were incessant. All over Damascus, but especially hard hitting on Bab Tuma, Bab Sharqi. Now, this time in Syria, I stayed in Bab Tuma, but I mean, it's quite close to Bab Sharqi. And there are still mortars sometimes, but not to the degree that there were before. There's some sort of agreement in which well, it's not an agreement. The terrorists realize for every mortar they send, they're going to get pounded in retaliation. So this is incentive for them to not be sending these mortars on Damascus, on civilians of Damascus. And because there's been a cessation of these mortars, I saw in Bab Sharqi all sorts of new sidewalk and rooftop cafes and pubs opened, whereas before, at nighttime, there's nobody on the street. Well, very few people on the streets. There's certainly no cafes. So to me, this just showed what an incredible, as soon as the mortars stop, people open up a new business and they start living their life again. And even in areas where the mortars hit, people clean up right away and get back to life. Because, as many people, Syrians there told me, we're not going to stop living our lives. And, you know, if I'm out walking and a mortar kills me, so be it. But I'm not going to stay home and cower because they can hit me at home as well. Yeah, but above all, like in Tartus, this was another amazing example of the resilience and pulse of life in Syria. Because Tartus, while it may be removed from attacks by mortars and missiles, Tartus has suffered greatly. Many people from Tartus are serving in the Syrian Arab Army and have been martyred while defending Syria. While I was there, I was able to visit a beach, and the scene there, the pulse of life, there were people, internally displaced people from all over Syria, even from Raqqa and from Deir ez-Zor, from Aleppo. And this is the same in Latakia, in Damascus, in Sweda, in Jeble. There are displaced people that have fled terrorist areas and that have restarted their lives in government-secured areas. And in Tartus, I myself was even surprised, walking along the beach, seeing people from Tartus, whether they were dressed, you know, whether they're Christians, whether they're Muslims, on the beach, smoking shisha, swimming, like it was dancing, singing, eating, drinking. It was a scene that even I didn't expect after many times in Syria, because it just seemed so normal. But then the friend that I was with said, don't think that these people are oblivious to the war. Every family here has lost somebody thanks to the war on Syria. So they've lost somebody, but they still want to continue their life as if they're right.
Wow, it's sad, but it's also inspiring to know that they are carrying on and doing their lives and all that. Yeah. Eva, one thing that we were really curious about is, according to what you heard on the ground and everything, how does the Syrian people see the Russian incursion against ISIS, or the intervention, and Putin himself maybe? What do they think about it?
In general, what I've seen is that the Syrians support it, because what they see is that since Russia physically entered into fighting terrorism in Syria late last year, October, November last year, they've actually made concrete achievements. I mean, the liberation of Palmyra was on the ground thanks to the brave soldiers of the Syrian Arab Army and their allies, but they were given Russian air cover. And, you know, Russia has been targeting terrorist strongholds and terrorist convoys and fuel convoys. They've actually, and Russia was invited. I think that's the most important thing. Russia was invited by the Syrian government, whereas this so-called Western so-called coalition that claims to be attacking terrorists in Syria have done almost nothing. They enabled and allowed a convoy of terrorists to occupy Palmyra, you know, crossing through open desert and crossing from various angles upon Palmyra. They did nothing to stop that, because they clearly didn't want to stop the terrorists from occupying Palmyra. So when you compare that to what the Russians have done, and the Russian statements too, politically the Russians always maintain Syrian sovereignty and the need to stop terrorism. And again, referring to this UN resolution 2253, reading the UN press release, one of the Russian representatives, their statement was saying quite clearly, we need to stop those who are sponsoring terrorism in Syria. You read any of the other statements by Western leaders, and they say nothing about that. So, politically and on the ground, Russia has achieved many things in favor of defending Syria. So the people that I met were quite happy to see Russia there. I mean, in Latakia, just by chance, I came across a group of Russians in the market, and the way that Syrians were greeting them is kind of like, you know, they were happy to see them. I know that the corporate media will say that that Syrians are unhappy at Russia's presence, or Syrians are being slaughtered, but this is the corporate media that is lying about Aleppo, who is in Aleppo, which terrorists are being killed, and when the terrorists are being killed by a Russian strike or Syrian strike, this somehow in the corporate media gets transmitted into this terrorist is somehow a civilian. So by and large, the people that I met all over Syria were pleased that Russia was standing with Syria, particularly given that so many countries are against Syria and have done nothing to secure Syria's sovereignty and safety.
Okay, thank you. And just following up on that, recently China has said that they are going to increase their support to Syria, that they're going to be training the army and sending some other forces maybe. Have you heard any opinions about that, like what the Syrians think about that, or anything?
Not widely, because I think China announced that after I had left Syria, but in general, China is another state that has not bowed to imperialism, and is a state that has politically sided with Syria in many instances in the UN, vetoing, aggressive resolutions put forth by Western nations. And my understanding also is that this is not a new thing, that China has been offering support in other ways to Syria, maybe by political support. I would imagine that most Syrians would welcome it. Essentially, what Syrians want is an end to the war. So if there's a nation that is saying, we're going to help you fight terrorism, we're going to help you cut off the flow of terrorists, then most Syrians would welcome that. They don't want to be fighting. Syria did not ask for this war. It's defending itself, but Syrians are keen, and President Assad himself has said this many times. They just want it to be over so they can get back to their normal lives. So I would imagine China's announced entry would be welcome, but not by the corporate media, not by Western leadership.
Okay, thank you. And just another follow-up question that it's also about other countries kind of helping. What about Iran? How is Iran perceived by the Syrian people, and what are they doing to help as well? Because we know that they have been helping too, right? Is that correct?
Yes, they have. I mean, I don't know the full extent, but I mean, they do have people supporting on the ground in Syria, and I imagine they're offering some sort of intelligence support and obviously political support. And again, I would think that the same feeling is that anybody who's going to help us defend our land, who is invited by the Syrian government, is welcome. Bottom line, China, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, countries or groups that are helping defend Syria are welcome. I mean, Syrians are very proud of their sovereignty, so obviously they haven't, to my knowledge, they haven't felt the threat that any one of these countries is going to take over Syria, nor have I seen evidence of that. But they have at least seen that these countries are offering tangible and real support, whereas, the Western coalition talks about fighting terrorism and does nothing except support terrorism.
There is another country that sticks out like a sore thumb, and the reason is that nobody speaks about them. And it's quite obvious that they have something to do with this, and you're probably guessing which country I'm thinking about just now, which is Israel. We've read reports about Israeli troops getting across the border and taking care of the wounded of jihadists in Syria, which is like a very peculiar combination if we contrast this to the mainstream narrative, no? How could Israel be supporting jihadists? But it seems that for Israelis, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I don't know what's going on exactly there. Do you have any sense of this? We know you've been in Palestine as well, so you are quite familiar and close to the way Israel operates. Do you have any comments to make on that particular?
Yeah, I would just say one thing. I'm not close to, or I'm not familiar with how they operate, except being on the receiving end of how they kill and starve Palestinians and their sadistic policies. But yeah, I mean, it's actually documented. When I met with the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations, Dr. Bashar al-Jafri, in early 2015, I interviewed him, and he told me how, and then I later researched it, and he was saying how the UNDOF, the UN Observation, blah, 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 can't remember the acronym, they're based in the occupied Golan, Syria's Golan, and in theory, they're there to monitor, and to monitor what's happening on the Zionist side and what's happening in Syria. He said that that the people on the ground issued reports saying they saw activity between the so-called Israelis and terrorists in Syria, including exchange of weapons, including Israeli military jeeps crossing into the Golan. These reports were written, but nothing was ever done with them in the United Nations. Aside from that, in many instances, I've met soldiers who served down near the Golan, and they said they saw with their own eyes Israelis interacting with terrorists. And then, of course, it is documented that the Zionists do treat terrorists in their hospitals. I mean, even there was a British channel. I can't remember it offhand, but the reporter was embedded with Zionist soldiers. Sorry, there's a bit of a background noise here. It's not too bad. The reporter was embedded with Zionist soldiers, and he, as usual, made it out to be a very dramatic, go Israel, you're doing a very valuable thing here kind of story, and brave Israeli soldiers. Like, he tried to gloss it over, but essentially he was embedded with them, and they went to they were going to the border to retrieve wounded terrorists, patch them up, and then send them back into Syria. There's no question that Israel benefits from what's happening in Syria. They call these mercenaries, these death squads in Syria, they call them jihadists. And certainly the Wahhabis have their influence over a number of them. And so these crazy Wahhabi lunatics that are holding weapons in Syria and beheading people and beheading children and firing rockets on civilians, etc., they may have their warped and extremely warped ideologies, but a number of the other mercenaries on the ground are simply death squads, and they go and they work for whomever pays them. And above all, even these crazy Wahhabis, they're not going to attack Israel. And I think that's something that needs to be highlighted, because the way the corporate media says, and the Western world says, terrorists attacking, Europe, or terrorists from Syria attacking in other places. In my opinion, and when some of these attacks happen, in many instances they're false flag attacks designed or used to then say we need to bomb Syria. But you will never see any of these mercenaries attacking Israel, because they're either working for Israel or there's an understanding that Israel is not the target. Although, if they were, as they're portrayed to be, crazy Islamists, then Israel would be their prime target because of the occupation and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. But they've never attacked Israel, and Israel is helping them. So, and Dr. Shaban himself pointed that out. Like, Israel is benefiting. The Zionist plan is benefiting from the destruction and chaos in Syria. And at the same time that all this is happening in Syria, the Zionists continue to steal more land, continue to murder more Palestinians, and their Saudi allies continue to murder Yemeni civilians. So, yeah, I think there's a reason that Israel is not talked about when we're talking about what's happening in Syria.
Well, thanks a lot. In order to maybe not to change subject too much, but maybe to move from region to region, just yesterday I read a news article regarding that the Kurds, or the Kurd army, I think it was in northern Syria, had attacked the Syrian army, that had broken with the agreement that they had engaged in. So I was wondering, what do you think, or where do you think this might come from? Do you feel that maybe the Kurds might be influenced from outside to cause even more chaos within the country, or is this something that has always been the case with the Kurds and the Syrian people being sort of at odds with each other?
I'm not an expert on Kurdish relations, and I don't want to get too deep into it because I can't really speak that deeply on it, but I did meet with a Kurdish opposition leader in April 2014, and she made it clear that while her party had aspirations of certain things for Kurdish rights in Syria, they wanted to be a part of Syria. She was very clear about that. They had no plan of being a separate entity within Syria. On the other hand, when the Kurds some months ago issued their declaration that they were going to have their own autonomous region in Syria, this is something that is that area. Again, I'm just going to speak in general, but that area is not only Kurds, the region that they propose. It's also other Syrian ethnicities and religions there. So for the Kurds to say this is going to be our area, obviously this is going to be contentious to the Syrian people themselves, not just the government and the sovereignty of Syria. But also, the U.S. is supporting the Kurdish project. Israel is supporting the Kurdish project. So I think that in itself speaks to the foreign agenda behind this claim for wanting sovereignty in Syria. And I think that people can support Kurdish rights. There's nothing wrong with supporting any people's rights, but be aware of who's backing them. Be aware of the fact that you may see the face card might be a Kurd saying, I want this and this, but who is backing them? And if it's American Israel, come on, it's not about human rights. It's not about Kurdish rights. It's about having some sort of control over a certain area of Syria. And as far as the Kurds, if they, I didn't see that report because I've been, even though I'm currently in Lebanon, but I've still been a little bit busy and not always having Wi-Fi, so I haven't seen that report. But I mean, if the Kurds are, and they have in the past, I believe, attacked the Syrian army, and that says a lot. Like the Syrian people wouldn't stand for that because the Syrian Arab army is the Syrian people. And so if the Kurds are attacking them in that instance, then this is going to create serious problems.
Eva, do people in Syria perceive, from your perspective, that the end of the conflict is near?
I can't answer that because nobody knows if it's near. I think that people are really just living day to day. I mean, they're strong and they're stoic and resilient, but they're exhausted as well. Almost 6 years of war on Syria, and they've lost so much, not just physically, their buildings, their heritage, but they've lost family members, and they've lost life opportunities. I mean, there's so many men serving the Syrian Arab Army that have been serving beyond their mandatory period of service because they want to defend Syria, but this means they're putting their life on hold. They're not getting married, they're not having children. Or maybe because of the sanctions and the effects of the war on Syria, they can't afford to get married and have children. So people definitely, they want it to be over yesterday. As far as hoping, I think that in a sense it's similar to how Palestinians felt or feel, I think, although ironically there's more support for the Palestinian issue, which is a good thing, there is that support. But I know, having lived in Gaza, Palestinians there feel very isolated and never feel like it's going to be over anytime soon. And I think that Syrians feel that same sense of isolation and uncertainty as to when the war on Syria will be over. But and they're still living, they're still determined to keep their sovereignty. So that's really all I can say. Nobody knows when it's going to be over, but we hope it will be over soon.
I think it's an hour now, and we don't want you to stay longer than you need to. So in order to close up a little bit, we wanted to ask you what would be a message, if you have any message that you would like to speak about to the Spanish world, especially. What would you like to say?
I would encourage you to read SOTT because SOTT is reporting fairly and truthfully. I would encourage people everywhere to question their media sources. If they're watching corporate media, there's an agenda behind this corporate media with the reporting. So please, please, please seek out alternative sources because while the corporate media version might be slick and might be very convincing, it's because they have money to be slick and convincing. Whereas the Syrian, what the Syrians are reporting on the ground is 100% different from what corporate media will report. I'd also encourage people to try to, if they can visit Syria, please do, because if you do, you see a different story. And don't believe this. Don't believe the lies that the Syrian people want a different president. They want changes in their government, but any people in any country want changes, and they want certain, political reforms. That's not specific to Syria, but the Syrian people don't want a change of government. They, in fact, see President al-Assad as somebody who unites Syria and is good for Syria. Perhaps that will change in the future, but please don't believe the NGOs that tell you these lies about people's will or the lies about Aleppo. Please understand that people suffering in Aleppo and in Foa and Fadia and other places due to the terrorist rockets and their terrorism in general. And the other thing I would encourage people, Syria's Grand Mufti, Sheikh Hassoun, is one of the most remarkable people I've met. He's the Mufti, so he's the highest religious authority in Syria, in Islam. But his vision, he speaks of love all the time. He has Christians who call him for advice. He has Christians who call him to have him explain things in Christianity. He's so open-minded, and it's especially what he says, what you're seeing, this depiction of Islam, it's not Islam. So please don't start believing that these Wahhabis, these mercenaries on drugs or whatever they're taking, represent Islam, because they don't. But he also speaks again of love, of unity, and he just really represents the secularism and coexistence that Syria always was prior to 2011. So I would just ask people to seek out independent media sources and to share, to really share the truth about Syria, because we're up against a massive corporate media and human rights complex that is incredibly well funded. And for us to get the truth out for Syrians could mean that this war on Syria stops. I have an audience. So yes, please just seek out independent media, and please don't believe the lies.
Eva, could you please share with us your blog address so that our listeners keep up with your work?
Yeah, so my blog is actually, it's called In Gaza, because when I started it, I had just arrived in November 2008, and I wanted it to be about Gaza and what was happening there. I've kept the same name, and I'm actually glad, because this is one point I really think we should address just quickly. There has been a major rift in people, between people who support Palestine and Palestinian rights, and those who support Syria and Syria's sovereignty and Syrian Arab Army and Syrian people. Because, unfortunately, when I was just talking about these NGOs and the corporate media, and certain Palestinian leadership have used Syria, they've betrayed Syria, especially certain Palestinian leadership, Hamas, have betrayed Syria, but other people that support Palestinians, certain news sites, they give a completely false account of what's happening in Syria, for whatever reason, financial or ideological. And so this has caused a major rift, and many people who knew me and my work for Palestine, we've parted ways on Syria because they believe the headlines that all the cliches about Syria. So I would. So what I was going to say was, I'm glad that my blog is still in Gaza, because for those who maybe come to the blog looking for information on Palestine, I would hope that they see what I'm reporting, and I'm honestly just reporting what I see in Syria, and I would hope that maybe makes them think and reassess what they think they know about Syria, or what the Middle East Eye is lying about, or what Electronic Intifada is lying about, or what all these Palestinian figureheads who have platforms but are actually lying about Syria. I would hope that people, they go to my blog, ingaza.wordpress.com. You can see what I've seen on the ground and make up your own mind, but please at least open your mind some, because it really is a matter of life and death in terms of the Syrian people.
Well, Eva, thank you very much for this interview, and thanks for all your great work. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva.
Sorry about the technical difficulties, but I'm glad you hooked up.
It went really perfect.
Thank you, Eva.
It was a pleasure to have you with us.
Really nice to meet you all. It's great to be in touch with people around the world that are working for truth.
It was, yeah, you're really, truly an inspiration to everyone, to most of us here, so I really want to thank you, sincerely.
Thank you.
And take care of yourself down there, okay?
Okay.
Sure. Bueno,
All right.
pues muchísimas
Bye.
gracias a todos por haber estado con nosotros. Nos vemos la próxima semana. Ya saben, cuídense mucho y a poner atención a las señales. Nos estamos viendo.
Ciao.